What is up, everybody? I'm Ryan Thomas. Welcome to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I am your host once again. If you have not checked out the title, this is my UFC 204 Pick'em, as I am picking the main event of this card, why I feel that this will, or how I feel this will go down, and why I am choosing Dan Henderson to wear gold by night's end on Saturday, October 8th. I'm very excited for this fight. This fight went down at UFC 199. Really, this is how this fight got made. Dan Henderson was on the undercard fighting Hector Lombard. Or not on the undercard, on the main card, fighting Hector Lombard. The main event of that card was UFC middleweight champion at the time, Luke Rockhold, putting his belt on the line against Michael Bisping on 17 days' notice. Bisping shocked the world. He won the title. Henderson, once again, emphatically won via TKO over Hector Lombard. And the fight was made from that moment on. This fight is part 2. Bisping versus Henderson part 2. And really, there's a flux of casual fans in the sport of mixed martial arts, fans that have kind of latched on to the Conor McGregors of the world, and the Sage Northcutts and guys like that, that weren't really following the sport back in 2009 when we had the Ultimate Fighter Team USA versus Team UK season in which Dan Henderson and Michael Bisping were the opposing coaches. And that was the avenue, that was the vehicle that kept the UFC locomotive moving. The marketing magnet of the UFC was, and still somewhat is, the Ultimate Fighter. But at that point, it was more so then than it is now. Now you have other shows like Looking for a Fight, where Dana White goes out and travels the country, and there's more promotions in which guys are more known than they were. The sport has grown to the extent that they don't necessarily need the Ultimate Fighter to find talent. They just still use it as an avenue of the many that are now available to find the talent. And now, Dan Henderson is 46 years old. When he first fought Bisping, he was 38. So it's not like he was a spring chicken then, 46 years old now. Dan Henderson has always defied the laws of logic in terms of his strength, his ability to wrestle at that old of an age. He is a farm boy, a guy that came from the farm and baled hay and did chores around the farm. That I think is the reason why he has the strength, the mobility that he does at the ripe age of 46. Not many 46-year-old men could do what Dan Henderson is doing right now, competing at the highest level in the top mixed martial arts organization. His accomplishments range from the UFC to Pride. Obviously in Pride, he was a two-weight champion, something that Conor McGregor is trying to accomplish himself in the UFC on November 12th at UFC 205. So Dan Henderson was that guy. Pride back then was the number one organization, and Dan Henderson did accomplish that feat. And obviously, this is a sequel. So this is part 2, where Dan Henderson emphatically knocked out Michael Bisping on the biggest card of all time, UFC 100. It's been surpassed as of recently by McGregor and Diaz, 2. But for many years, that was back in 2009, for many years, UFC 100 was the mega card of the UFC, the all-time highest-grossing, highest-selling pay-per-view in UFC history. Card that featured George St. Pierre and Thiago Alves, Dan Henderson and Michael Bisping, and then the heavyweight title in the main event put heavyweight champion Brock Lesnar versus Frank Mir. So it was a trifecta card, a huge card, where there was a lot at stake for every fight. Also on that card was John Jones. Fought an unknown fighter, I think it was Tommy O'Brien or something like that. I don't even know the guy's name, I can't even remember. But John Jones was on that card as well. think it was Jake O'Brien. Now that I'm thinking of that, I'm going to look that up now. But anyway, this fight, I am so happy that this fight was made. In talking to David Poole, we talked about this fight, and really, I wanted this fight to happen. I never thought it actually would, and I'm excited for Saturday. We got a few more days leading up to this event. And it's an event that I didn't think we would get the chance to see. I thought we would see Bisping versus Rockhold 3. I thought we would see Bisping versus Jacare. But I'm very glad that we get to see this main event take place. Now, this does kind of go against the UFC ranking system. But, I can make a case against Eddie Alvarez and Conor McGregor, but I can make a case for Michael Bisping versus Dan Henderson 2. This fight was picked by Michael Bisping, who had been in the UFC for 10 years, paid his dues, is the lone fighter with the most main event appearances in UFC history. That is Michael Bisping. So, a 10-year quest to attain the middleweight championship in the fashion in which he did on 17 days' notice against a guy that was heavily favored to win over him. Bisping knocked out Luke Rockhold in the first round. So Bisping did have some pull here to pick who he wanted to fight in his first title defense. More so than Tyron Woodley has, and more so in my eyes than what Conor McGregor has, although Conor is the main draw. Michael Bisping has the case on his side that he actually paid his dues within the sport and maintained longevity within the middleweight division. He attained his goal by becoming the middleweight champion and picking that first title defense. And that first title defense is against the man that provided him with the most gruesome knockout of his career, and that was Dan Henderson at UFC 100. This fight has so many storylines wrapped into it as well. This is obviously Dan Henderson's supposed last fight, which, in my eyes, I will believe that when I see it. He is a guy that still has a lot of fight in him, a dog that has a lot of bite in him, you could say. You don't knock out a guy like Hector Lombard in the fashion in which Dan Henderson did, and Lombard took a little while to come off the mat to stand up. So Dan Henderson still has real power. And in analyzing this fight, not much has changed with either fighter. Bisping is a little bit more mobile, more active. He has more movement. He moves side to side more. Obviously, Michael Bisping has won 4 straight fights, including Luke Rockhold and Anderson Silva. His last 2 wins, include Anderson Silva and Luke Rockhold. And Dan Henderson has had some losses. Daniel Cormier, Vitor Belfort. So, Bisping has kind of peaked at this age, where Dan Henderson is obviously long in the tooth. But the skill sets remain the same. Dan Henderson is going to look to land that right hand. Michael Bisping is going to look to avoid that right hand, pick his shots, pepper Dan Henderson with punches and kicks. And Dan Henderson is going to be looking to land that big right hand. The one dynamic of this fight that really has stayed true in my mind is that Bisping's style, with that style, he has to win every single second of this fight. He'll have to dominate Dan Henderson in order to win this fight. And I don't see him doing that. Dan Henderson has to win maybe 3 or 5 seconds of this fight. All it takes is just one shot. And although Dan Henderson is long in the tooth, he still has better wrestling than Michael Bisping, a 2-time Olympian in Dan Henderson, a Greco-Roman Olympian in the 92 games and the 96 games. So Dan Henderson has been competing for as long as I've been alive. I was born in 1992. So Dan Henderson has been around a long time. He's as experienced as they get. While his whiskers have come to be soft over the course of the last few fights, he's shown that his chin is not where it once was, and Bisping has shown that his power is better than what it once was. I honestly feel that Dan Henderson could win this fight just by landing that one shot. And he has had the propensity to land that one shot time and time again over the course of his career. And Dan Henderson, some guys are just a kryptonite to another fighter. And in my eyes, I see Dan Henderson being that kryptonite to Michael Bisping, walking out of that octagon with the UFC middleweight belt wrapped around his shoulder or wrapped around his waist as the UFC middleweight champion. Whether he rides off into the sunset or not, that only time will tell. But I have a hard time believing that Dan Henderson would retire rather than defend the belt. It would be an amazing way to go out, a Peyton Manning style, to go out that way as a champion for all the stuff that he had accomplished in his career, for the UFC belt to elude him, and then for him to attain that in his final fight. It would be the most poetic ending in mixed martial arts history. And in my eyes, I really feel, and I've said this to a lot of MMA journalists and MMA fans that I know, this is the greatest main event in the history of the UFC. And that is a statement that I truly believe in, because this fight didn't need to be marketed, doesn't need to be, put on billboards. For the hardcore MMA fans, this fight is going to sell, and it's going to sell, I think, pretty decent, in a very great way. I don't think the UFC has marketed this card enough. I talked extensively to David Poole about that. Also on this card, Vitor Belfort versus Gegard Mousasi, Ovince St. Preux versus Jimmy Manuwa. So there are fights that matter on this card, and it has kind of been under the radar. But I feel that it is a great card. I'm very excited for Saturday night, UFC 204. I am going with Dan Henderson over Michael Bisping. I think Dan Henderson will find the right-hand shot to land on Bisping. This fight is going to end either way via knockout. Either Henderson's going to get knocked out or Bisping is going to get knocked out. And I feel that neither one of these guys will bring their submission skills to the table. This fight is going to be a fight. We're going to see punches. We're going to see kicks. We're going to see clinch work. And that's another dynamic of the fight that Dan Henderson will own. He is a Greco-Roman style fighter, training out of Team Quest back in the day with Randy Couture and Chael Sonnen, two of the best wrestling artists in mixed martial arts. And Dan Henderson is one of the best, if not the best. So, going with Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping. For the other fights on the card, I'm going to go with Gegard Mousasi over Vitor Belfort. I think Vitor is at the end of his career. He has shown that the cheating ways of his career over the last few years might be catching up to him. His body doesn't look the same. He didn't look the same against Chris Weidman. He didn't look the same against Jacare Souza. That's without a doubt. And he hasn't looked the same since he beat Dan Henderson jacked up on TRT. So I'm going to go with Gegard Mousasi, and I'm going to go with Ovince St. Preux versus Jimmy Manuwa. Ovince St. Preux really put on an impressive performance against John Jones. He hung in there with him. He went the distance with him. I'm going to go with Ovince St. Preux over Jimmy Manuwa. I think Ovince St. Preux is one of the more underrated UFC light heavyweight fighters on the roster. I'm going to go with Dan Henderson, Gegard Mousasi, and Ovince St. Preux. The three main fights on the UFC 204 main card. There you have it. Dan Henderson will win the UFC middleweight title. Book it. I'm going to pick it. That's my pick for UFC 204. Thank you guys for listening to the Thomas Take. I will have more of the podcast episode of myself and David Poole broadcasted live today. Thank you.